synchronously can do so. Can at least look at what you're looking at right now. And then what I'm gonna do is I got a new, like, as you can see, maybe you've noticed I'm in the office today because I have a new toy now. It's I can check. Oh, it's one of these things, right? It's a knee. So that's what I'll be doing today. And what? And yeah, well, so we'll see how that goes. So what I'm going to share with you is a whiteboard, an electronic whiteboard. Oh, okay. Yeah, so that's what, so hopefully you see that, and I'm still getting used to, there it is. There's my cursor. Okay, I'm still getting used to using this. So the handwriting might not be as good as what you're used to from the whiteboard in the classroom, but I think the overall visibility will be a bit better. In fact, I'm fairly sure of it. So if you'll recall, what are we talking about? We're talking about outcomes. And today, looking at obviously the two different movements, I guess I will start with environmental justice in case Lena is able to join us later when she's going to be talking about the outcomes of the feminist movement. And what? And you might have noticed, I mean, these articles aren't certainly couched in the same terms that Almeida uses that we were talking about on Thursday. So I'm going to try to kind of fit those in there, maybe get us thinking about how to apply those thoughts on outcomes and tactics. Well, it's a work in progress for me, and so we're all on this educational journey together. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about environmental justice first. And so EJ, right? Environmental justice. Okay, I don't know why I'm spacing my letters out so much, but there you go. Well, okay, let's do the 4 key points, right? And these are on what, page 392 in your book. Everybody has the right to protection from environmental harm. Everybody has, right, we should prevent threats before they harm people. This third one is really more of a political process issue. So these are kind of theoretic, existential, philosophic kind of issues. The third point, though, is really a political process question or point or demand that the burden of proof should be on the firms, not people who would be harmed. regarding environmental threats. So it's really the burden of proof should be on a firm like, so Exxon or Sunoco, right, a big oil processing firm, should have to prove that its new facility is not going to hurt people, rather than people who live nearby a facility like that having to prove that the facility will hurt people and have to prevent it. And then finally, and this is more of a tactics thing, the grassroots organization should use politics to what? To challenge inequalities. And really, in terms of what we see, oops, that's not what I want to do. What happened? Okay, wait, can I Control Z that? Sorry. Okay. In terms of what the article's talking about, a lot of what it's talking about is how they do use politics to challenge inequality, right? So what do we really want to talk about here? What we're really talking about specifically is, or more specifically, our key cases tend to be cases where Black communities were targeted for, I guess, environmentally harmful businesses. And specifically, they focus on these waste dumping businesses. So, and I'm not really specifically sure what that means. If that's like coke from coal burning plants, or chemical storage. What a lot of the talk is about is a particular movement and cluster of activists on the south side of Chicago who were concerned really about emissions from active industrial plants. And really what we're seeing here is, whoa, I don't know what I just did. No, stop doing that. Why are you doing that? No. What is this? I pressed some button and now I'm drawing tiny lines everywhere and I can't make it stop. Okay, it stopped. Now I have to get an eraser. Sorry, bear with me. Erase that. Oh, shit. Oh, God. Sorry, guys. Hope you remember what that says, because now I don't. And now I went, All right, a black pen. Black community where we're targeted for, right? All right, and so what? Okay, just a couple of terms we need to know here. Well, okay, a couple of things. This points to grassroots organizing. And local activism. So, as opposed to some of these movements we've been talking about, and certainly when we get later to the women's movement, we're talking about like really large-scale organizations trying to solve society-wide problems. Here we're focusing on local organizations trying to solve local problems, and a specific kind of term. And again, we want to extract lessons from this, but we do have to know some of the specifics. Specifically, LULUs, which is locally unwanted land uses. And you might also note, it's kind of funny. I mean, historically, words have histories, right? It's related to the word NIMBY, right? NIMBY means not in my backyard, but NIMBYism now carries this connotation of, I guess the word is probably Karens now, right? This seems to be the way everybody puts it. It's like middle class white people are the NIMBYists, right? They don't want, like, and usually it's something like, oh, we don't want a halfway house. Like this specifically came up in Chicago. We don't want a halfway house for unwed mothers in our neighborhood. And everybody kind of was like, oh yeah, that's like really like, it's not cool to hate unwed mothers, right? So NIMBY has kind of taken on a negative connotation. So in the literature nowadays, it seems to be moving towards this term LULUs. So people locally unwanted land uses, which kind of gets you a little bit more focused on that environmental dimension there. What did I do? Where did it go? Holy shit! Excuse me. Sorry. Just disappeared. How did it do that? Okay. Can it come back? Will it come back? Thank God. Okay. What? No. Don't. What? Sorry. Oh. It got bigger. Okay. NIMBYs, LULUs. Sorry. Okay. Still getting used to it. Bear with me. All right. So how to do this? Again, mostly we're talking at the local level, but what we're pointing out here is that they have developed a network of local organizations. And so in terms of tactics and outcomes, right, you might consider that in terms of allies and coalitions here. Because there's this expression in the environmental movement. I don't think they say it here, but it's like the environmentalists have to win every time. It only takes one win for for a polluting firm for the pollution to happen, right? For the pollution not to happen, these grassroots organizations have to win every time. So, the neighborhood that's trying to keep out, like a waste burning plant has to win every time that some company comes into town and tries to buy up this land and start that waste burning plant. And so what they're pointing out has been helpful is that, yes, you've got these local organizations, but you can develop these kind of regional networks to share tactics, share ideas, share plans, share connections with politicians, in order to kind of build up some kind of persistent infrastructure there. And the also, with respect, again, this is, our general like tactics, what makes movement successful. Your other allies here include things like we've seen before, other existing groups. So churches, neighborhood organizations, and schools. And the school thing can really mean K-12 or local colleges and universities. So, again, as you guys kind of know, well, I can't think of one. I don't know. Maybe you can if you want to chime in. If you know of any activism that Eckert has done against specific environmental harms, I can't think of any recently. Well, a little bit the sanitation plant, although that's almost our own personal problem, just as Eckert, trying to.
I think they did two movements.
For around what?
There were two. There was sorry, my computer's lagging. But there was like something about protecting bees, because I think we were using like pesticides that killed bees. And then I think it was just like another pesticide movement against
Oh, so like we were the bad guys in that case. Using like
we were the bad guys, but there was like the students going. Yeah, the students were like protesting against it. So there was like people that dressed and like sat outside of like James Center and stuff.
All right. Okay. Yeah. So again, kind of always, the student population is a good population to draw on for those kind of activities. But also recognizing like K-12, like PTAs and that sort of thing, right? So elementary to high school age kids, it's generally in the best interests of a school to be in a non-polluted place. And there are actually some semi famous incidents where schools have been polluted by local polluters. So there are like a couple of schools in northern Indiana that have had this problem, and so I've really kind of had to be really actively involved with trying to obtain environmental justice. Okay, so that and also what we call this experts. And this is clearly one area where experts, are important. I should note, this was specifically written in a context is like a sociology magazine. It's not really a journal. And so it's, it kind of is it's like spreading the good word of sociology for people. So the audience is a little bit funny. They emphasize sociologists, in terms of their ability to research things like community health. But you should also consider that there are probably people like doctors and chemists and others who are contributing here. Now, clearly, sociologists are contributing and have made important contributions in places to say, like, look, because we have these skills in doing statistics, we can say, like, look, here's a cancer cluster. These many kids have developed asthma in this neighborhood, clearly because there's a coal burning plant nearby. They don't mention, but you should also consider, clearly doctors or chemists would be important for the environmental justice movement as well. I'm not sure where I want to put this in here. I might just kind of put this in brackets. They're arguing that a sort of a should point, or maybe a can point, right? Because there is, like on the south side of Chicago, they try to demonstrate this. It can move to a broader focus on the environment. And health. And that would still be seen as part of the same movement, especially if it's like the local grassroots organization is working to do things like, well, they mentioned like farmers markets. They mentioned things like, it's not present. Oh, thank you, Linnea. Right, because the window closed. Now, so I was just entertaining myself for a while there. Okay, thank you. Yes, right, so there. So, blah, 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 right. EJ should move to a broader focus on environmental and health concerns within the neighborhood. They're conceptualizing this as, with the overall goal of the movement, if the overall goal of the movement is the environmental health, in a place, in an area, they should be doing things longer term. I think, also part of the suggestion here is that by sustaining those kinds of activities, you develop a stronger organization with a stronger, let's call it a footprint in the local area, where if a new threat emerges, they're still there. But also at the same time, they're talking about things like gardens and job programs, which is really, I would question that. Because we have a question sometimes with organizations of what we call mission creep. And what mission creep is, it means you have an EJ movement, the local grassroots organization that's trying to stop a waste burning plant from being built. Like, that's a very specific focus where you can concentrate your energy and maximize your impact by doing that. And you are galvanizing people around that particular issue. If you start trying to galvanize people around other aspects of the issue, you may have a bad time, right? It may be more difficult to get that organized. You may lose some constituents potentially. Their point, though, and we should certainly consider it, is that an EJ movement should be about the broader health of the community, and so an organization can enact these different things. And of course, buying fresh food or growing your own food, or having a job, which means health insurance and more money, etc. Those are all things that do contribute to the overall health of the community. Now, tactically, they and I think this was maybe something that Almeida didn't maybe pay enough attention to, because, like I said, Almeida was about the novelty of tactics. Tactically, though, what we're seeing with the EJ movement is a concentration on some really just basic non-disruptive things that we can do. So litigation. Litigation in terms of filing suit to prevent a organization from working or to stop an organization from working. And this is really, a bread and butter technique of social movement organizations. You see something bad, you should sue about it. Now, it is unsuccessful for the specifically discriminatory aspect of land use that we're talking about here. So the specific argument that placing say a waste burning plant in a predominantly African American area is discriminatory. It's incredibly hard to prove. The courts haven't gone for it. That being said, that there have been plenty of cases of things like success for damages. So, I mean, and it's certainly not where I imagine the environmental justice movement wants to be. You don't want to come in after the fact and, have people who are, getting cancer or various lung diseases and getting money from them. But it does, in the sort of the overall scope of things, change corporate practices. Corporations know that they may be exposing themselves to serious, liability from litigation. They may be dissuaded from engaging in certain practices in the future. Again, you don't want those people to be damaged, but that is a real tactic of these organizations that has proven successful in a number of cases. They do point to, though, again, what Almeida liked, which are your disruptive protests. Which could be anything from, protesting in the State House or on the steps of the State House, to even things like chaining yourself to a bulldozer to try to stop a plant from being built or a dump from going up in your neighborhood. So there's some success with those protests, and again, the targets there are state actors and the corporations themselves. You'll see this sometimes. Well, I mean, I guess a great example of this would have been the DAPL protest, right? The protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline, where they were actually physically putting themselves, the protesters were physically putting themselves in the way of the Keystone Company's construction equipment, that sort of thing. Although we know, that had limited success. Although, right now, Keystone has been held up again in the courts, right? So there is some pointing to not the legislative, but the litigation as a successful tactic. So disruptive protests as a tactic, and lobbying as a tactic. And again, I think Almeida really undersells this, but with respect to the EJ movement, there's been some legislative success. he points up the Congressional Black Caucus kind of taking this up, and trying to pass laws against discriminatory land use. And specifically, more specifically, pointing up at the executive level. So the president, Clinton, used executive orders. So what was it? Is it so, right, so just basically ordering agencies as they make decisions to approve permits and that sort of thing, ordering agencies to apply environmental justice, non-discriminatory principles. I would point, though, to the problem with that. So is that it is, whoops, what is that? I don't know what that is. This is always going to vary with politics, though, pretty significantly. And this is sort of a general problem in our national level politics, especially right at the moment. He points out, or they point out, that while Clinton put this executive order in place, because it's an executive order, it's not legislation, it's not a law that's been passed by Congress, there's nothing that really forces subsequent executives, subsequent presidents from enforcing this stuff. I didn't do all the homework and see, what Obama's policy was, but they already point out that, Bush basically wasn't about enforcing environmental justice. And I'm sure that, specifically you can look to the Keystone project, to see that the Trump administration is nowhere on the same page as environmentalists in terms of advocating for environmental justice. So again, the point being there that getting things done, lobbying the executive is really only successful in the short term, for as long as that executive remains in power. And look to this too for a lot of other kinds of social movements, right? So we have this, and I forget what the specific, Linnea might be familiar with this. What do you know? What's the name of the act or the clause that says that we can or we can't provide aid for abortion, family?
Yeah, the Hyde Amendment.
The Hyde Amendment, right? And different executive branches interpret that differently, and so American policy on family planning globally, changes with the executive. If stronger laws were in place, so if there were more successful national level legislation, the executive would be more, I guess, constrained in what they can do. This has been, though, a sort of a problematic feature of American politics for at least the last 20 years or so, where it's really, really hard to pass federal legislation. Almost no laws are getting passed except in times of crisis with things like the CARE Act, right? So finally, I kind of hesitate with this point because I'm never quite sure what to do with that, and partly that's just me as someone who's not great at global sociology. But these guys are arguing that there needs to be a global impact of the environmental justice movement, and at the very least, a global network of organizations. And they're fairly critical. I should say, though, they are they're writing in what, 2007 now, so things may have changed. This is certainly not my specialty. American organizations may be better about global networking now. I'm not sure. Their point, though, is that it is a global issue, and I can certainly see that conceptually, especially as, you know, as they point out, what is tending to happen, or what has tended to happen over the years, is that impacts are being shifted to the global south. You know, specifically the more polluting industries in the world, and you can think of things like electronics recycling that tend to have a lot of really nasty waste products, heavy metals being used in the processing of electronics. You know, that sort of thing doesn't happen much in America or Europe anymore. We send all our, you know, old computers, cell phones, whatever, to China, and then, you know, the environmental impacts in China or India, these other places, are pretty horrific. Again, you know, as a guy who's not super global in focus, though, you know, part of me is like, well, yes, and that's horrible, and that needs to be dealt with, you know, in those other local places. On the other hand, it's, you know, it's almost, it's a perverse kind of success for the kind of local environmental justice movements that they're talking about here. So, you know, if you can convince, or if you can sort of drive a polluting company out of business, or out of your area, you know, if you're in Birmingham, Alabama, or Jackson, Mississippi, and then they pack up their environmentally harming activities and go to China, that's a win for that local environmental justice organization. It may not be a win for, you know, global society or a win for the environment writ large, but it is a win for the poor people of Birmingham or Jackson. So I'm a little less than convinced, at least in terms of you know, what they would say is just sort of the necessity of networking. That said, they can network on tactics. Oops, did it again. And on lobbying. You know, so the more networked you are with other organizations, you know, be that locally or globally, the more tactics you will see, you know, the more ideas that you can apply to your own local cases, and the more effective you can be in terms of lobbying politicians. Because politicians ultimately are all about, like, how am I going to get the most money for my next campaign, and how am I going to keep the biggest swath of constituents happy? And politicians do still pay attention to that. Do still pay attention to, I guess, you know, the amount of noise being generated by a movement. Okay, so again, you know, that focuses us on a few different tactics, and also, I mean, you know, they don't really talk in terms of levels of success. But I think we can at least minimally consider, you know, some degree of policy outcome. You know, so getting getting executive orders across. Is a policy success, and certainly, but again, it's hard to talk about the environmental justice movement as such, right? It tends to be these local environmental justice organizations, but certainly some of them have real impact. In terms of things like closing a plant or getting cleanups put into place. And I think, on a certain level, there is this legislative there have been some legislative victories in terms of crafting policy for the EPA to create this, these Superfund sites, this idea that there are certain kinds of sites that will need to be cleaned up. I mean, that's a longer term policy impact as well. But certainly, for any of these places where plants get shut down, if a coal burning plant gets shut down, and they show, they have that one table of, sort of the declining number of basically garbage incinerators around the country. That's a real, what they call impact level of success, where the actual population is feeling some relief from the harm that they were experiencing. And then I would also, I'm not sure how much these authors would argue for it, but I think we could consider that there has been at least some structural change. And I would look to that in terms of, how we think about pollution, how we think about local plants and those kinds of things. I think, and maybe it's just living in the ivory tower, about around a bunch of hippies and environmental scientists, that people do now, think about environmental justice, that is kind of on the agenda. It's something that people think about when firms are building new plants and that sort of thing. I would call that structural change. I think these authors, Pellow and Bruhl, would be probably a little more dubious about that, right? Would really probably call for some kind of like broader legislation that would, do more towards ensuring that future plants don't get built and so on and so forth. Okay, are there questions regarding environmental justice or these kinds of impacts, outcomes, etc.? Still not seeing much. Okay, then let me check on a couple things. All right, I haven't heard from this. Okay. Okay, so I guess I will move on and I will try to teach about the decline of the women's movement. So where are we here? I'm going to draw a line. I want to draw a line. And this is, again, something we talk about, maybe not enough. We haven't talked about, but something that's a problem for movements research in general is measuring things like decline. You know, so we have some tactics like that, and I'm forgetting who it was. Was it Gamson? It was somebody, who did that newspaper research that allowed us to kind of see, the waves of different movements that we have. And certainly I think, from the 2001 perspective that Epstein was writing, we would say, like, yeah, the women's movement was in decline. But I'm still, I'm not entirely sure that was fair to say in 2001. It may be, or may have been, and I'm really not sure now. And this is kind of a question that I would put to you: is like, is the movement still in decline? Do things like the Women's March and Me Too, show that the movement either is still strong or is reinvigorated? So I just kind of, let you
I feel like
think.
it's always me talking, but I think that there are other movements that overpower the women's movements, particularly like environmental based movements right now. There's a lot of movements on like immigration and like immigrant rights and all that kind of stuff that I think overpower the women's movements. But I do think that the marches and the Me Too was a big, like, sort of like refresh of the movement. But overall, I think it's died down a lot.
Yeah.
I agree. I think that the idea of a women's movement in general is not as strong as it was, and I don't know if it will be, because it's moved on to figuring out more specific things that like each movement can focus on, like Me Too. Like, it's not about being a woman, it's about sexual harassment, like, specifically, and that's what the focus should be. And like same with like the abortion, like pro-choice movement, that's like more specific. It came out of the women's movement and the feminist movement. But I think that like not having a broad organized women's movement in the future is okay, because it's split up to be more focused and effective.
Interesting. Okay. But yeah, all right. So yeah, that helps me contextualize this a bit too, because then the kind of thing that Epstein is calling for, right, is different than that, right? So it's her concern. I mean, I think she's really seeing it as problematic that there's not that like big women's movement, and of course, this is, a baby boomer writing about the turn of the 20th century as compared to 1968 or the 70s, early 80s, when there was that just really broad-based fight for, like women's rights in general, or really a structural change in society. And some of the points that she carries forth on that are, and it's interesting, right? So she's not focused on abortion. She's not focused on sexual harassment, which really have become like a couple of the key major focuses, of, I guess, women's movements in recent years. So she's focused on things like, where is it? The pay gap, violence on poverty, and on childcare and housework. And there is, there is some activism around these issues, certainly. But I think the argument here is that this is all structural stuff. And remember, that's the level of impact that we've been talking about as being, the most difficult to attain, and the most kind of society changing, clearly. And thinking about all of this stuff, what we're really kind of getting towards is that women still experience patriarchy, and that the social structuring of society is still structured in this patriarchal manner. That means that men are still more valued at work. That means that men are still taught that they can use violence against women. That means that, well, this is a little bit more complicated, but means that women end up in poverty at greater rates. Of course, that is related to both the pay gap and to childcare. It's mostly about the fact that women tend to be single mothers, but of course, that's an expectation of the patriarchy, right? And this expectation for childcare and housework, being burdensome more to women than to men, is again this structural issue, that is specifically a feature of patriarchy. Okay, maybe this will help. Okay, sorry. Okay, so moving on then. I'm not a great feminist historian, feminist scholar. I will say, she talks about the first wave and the second wave. The decline of the first wave, is kind of an interesting subplot in here. The first wave of feminism is essentially suffrage. And the first wave, she's writing, it's part of kind of more broad progressive movements. It's very similar. It's starting alongside of the abolitionist movement. It finds success in the passage of the 19th Amendment. In 1919, women's suffrage, and then it falls into like weird decline and parochialism. And that parochialism really kind of being around, it just being a movement for white women, and even apparently some of those same suffragettes, were themselves anti-immigrant, anti-black, kind of, not great people. But of course, this is something that we expect in social movements in general, is that a success will lead to a decline. The question for her is, why the decline of the second wave? But what's weird to me with this is that I guess she doesn't believe in third wave feminism, or she's comfortable with subsuming third wave feminism. Third wave is about intersectionality. Some others have argued that, I mean, really, I think a good way to put it would be that the second wave was, and this is a really an oversimplification, but and, you know, as good of an oversimplification as I can make, but the second wave was about the Equal Rights Amendment. And so the second wave was, you know, basically about having a civil rights act of sorts for women that would ensure that you know, that women would be equal to men in everything from hiring to you know, decisions about the family, and et cetera, et cetera. The problem, I should watch. Oh yeah, I've been thinking about that. That's on Hulu though. Okay. Oh, and Schlafly. Okay, interesting. Yeah, so the problem with the second wave for a lot of people, well, and particularly for poor people and poor people of color, was that it was argued that the second wave largely was a middle class white women thing. So she almost tacitly recognizes that in some of the things that she writes, you know, but I don't. I think she may be missing a part of the problem for the second wave by not acknowledging the third wave as such. You know, and the third wave as such, you know, is to say that there are minority women, there are poor women, and there are women of different sexualities for whom the ERA certainly wasn't going to be the be all and end all of social justice that, you know, many women would, you know, that middle class white women would have felt it to be. Okay, so what happens to the movement? It becomes institutionalized and marginalized. And I think that's something that, you know, we might want to think about for movements in general. And so what she's especially talking about here are organizations, or real bureaucratic organizations like NOW, the National Organization of Women, or, you know, in different professional organizations, there are sort of these caucuses for women. So like in sociology specifically, we have an organization called SWS, which is like sociology or sociologists for women in society. And the argument here is kind of that when you get these bureaucratic organizations, they are more concerned with continuing to exist, continuing the organization, really, than social change. You know, you've heard this, or you may have heard this with respect to an organization like the Komen Breast Cancer Society, right? Where you find that like lots of the money, or maybe the majority of the money now that's going to that organization, goes to the upkeep of the organization. and this is, this is really just a kind of a basic sociological idea, that once you construct a bureaucratic organization, the primary goal of that organization becomes its survival. Whatever the stated goals of the National Organization of Women are, what they're really going to be worried about first and foremost is continuing as a bureaucratic organization. And so by nature, that means that they're less radical. By nature, that means they want to be kind of as inclusive and unscary to people as they can be. And clearly, a feminist like Epstein sees that as problematic and casts that as being a case where now, therefore, it is feminism is more of an idea than a movement. So women really aren't engaged in the kind of social movement activities, the kind of protests, the kind of, she's talking about like teach-ins and other things that were going on in the 60s and 70s and 80s to some extent. It's more of an idea than a movement. And what? Some of the other things, though, that really predicate this decline is in the professions. And again, I would cast this as a movement being the victim of its own success in a way. And I really wish Almeida would be a little more systematic about kind of that aspect of movement success. Success tends to lead, again, as I think I wrote this up here, right? Success leads to declines, right? Just as in the first wave, success led to the decline of the women's movement. To some extent, we can see the decline of what she is putting as second wave feminism, that decline is tied to their success as well. But, she, I think, rightly points out that it's a success for a particular class of women. And so in the professions, you get much broader opportunity. And pay equality. And this, this also comes down to, and I don't want to, get too far into the details of theories on the workplace and inequality, but it has a lot to do with what kinds of jobs we're talking about here. So this is what we call the primary labor market jobs. But in things like, and this isn't to say that it's everything's perfect. But in medical schools now, for example, or in law schools, right? Admissions are, in many cases surpassing 50-50 for women, right? Women are have basically equal standing, at least at that level. And in terms of firms hiring, firms are hiring women at an equal level, tend to be paying, at least at the outset, paying women equally. The problems, though, there are still certainly endemic problems as you go on through the professions, but many folks are now arguing that is tied to these other dimensions of patriarchy, where you have women who choose to be more family focused, or we'll see like in the medical professions, women will choose to be less focused on things like surgery and more likely to go into things like obstetrics and pediatrics, which tend to be lower prestige, tend to be less paid. But partly that's a choice because those professions are, or those specific specializations within the professions are more amenable to family life, right? Again, that is part of the patriarchy because women still have these expectations to be the caregivers and to do the mothering in families. Okay, very long, kind of long-winded explanation of the professions. The point that this brings us to, though, is that I don't think she quite puts it in these terms. That breeds complacency for a number of the women who would have been at the vanguard or who were at the vanguard of the women's movement in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Those women, and their sort of their class cohorts, people in the similar social class now, are relatively complacent because they got the jobs, they got the kind of successes that they were aiming for. In a sense, this is, again, what we might call a impact success. But again, that's for middle class women. And I think a lot of the worry here for Epstein and for a lot of feminists is that this really does not trickle downward in any way, maybe not in any way, but in a large measure, for working class women who are still exposed to like much worse pay differentials. I was seeing something interesting too, with the COVID, what do you call it? With the COVID rearrangement of the workforce, it is disproportionately women who are in the well, I guess we should say right now, the most dangerous jobs. Women are more in the essential jobs, or the jobs that are deemed essential in this economy. And of course, those are the jobs of compassion, like nursing, food service that we require. But of course, also, these are jobs that we know that the pay differentials are much worse for women, right? So women, doing nursing, or especially, God forbid, working in a nursing home right now, women are not nearly as well paid as men are in jobs that are similarly demanding. So a guy could be, a trucker, which is not a particularly intellectually demanding occupation, but is going to be paid a lot better than a nurse's aide, who's doing, arguably even more work, but at the same basic level of education, right? So this is, really a problem, in terms of the impact success. The working class is kind of left behind. But again, again, it's those working class women who are in less of a position to be, to be fighting for equality. Another another contribution to the decline that we should think about in movements is in general is factionalism. And so, this is generally a problem or a potential problem for all social movements. I would say, I'm not quite sure how to quantify this, but for movements that are more extreme, and she points out that there were some, and it goes, it's a kind of a fascinating history that I think we've mostly forgotten about. That in the Vietnam era through the early 1980s, there were lots of different revolutionary organizations. So organizations that were literally calling for the overthrow of the American political system. And she points out, some of these guys really believed it. A lot of them were Marxists. We've seen that one, the workers, the Socialist Workers Union, right, was one of these organizations that was kind of believing in that the system would break down, that people would want capitalism to end. They all largely overestimated their position. They didn't realize that the boomers would turn into, lawyers by the 1980s, that kind of thing, and really be kind of co-opted by capitalism. But that causes a problem specifically for feminism because, not only do you get, like a radical feminism that embraces a particular kind of revolution, you get multiple or many different feminisms that embrace many different visions of revolution or revolutionizing society, and they can't really work together anymore, and nor can they really, I would say, sustain that in general. So there's both the factionalism and just the general unsustainability of the revolutionary outlook, and that's been a problem for revolutionary movements forever. If the revolution doesn't happen, folks go off and get jobs and have families and kind of forget about it. And the other thing here is the universities, and well, I mean, it's interesting to me. This is both, in a sense, a strength and a weakness of this, but I think a number of different movements. They have a intellectual basis in colleges, in universities, and that's like I say, it's a strength because you want to have, you want this stuff to be well thought out. You want, again, kind of experts who can collect the statistics for you, make this stuff make sense. The weakness there, that and again, I kind of wonder a little bit about Epstein's perspective here, and it might be a little idiosyncratic, but there's certainly some of this. It is uncompassionate which was something that if you do go back and read some of the earlier, well, or the 60s, 70s intellectual feminists like Dorothy Smith, like they're pointing out like, oh, the university is a really incompassionate place. It doesn't treat people well. It especially doesn't treat women well. It's also a place of, I'm sure there's a better word for this, but strivers, people who seek out stardom. I mean, I guess you'd say egotists, or maybe more specifically narcissists in some cases. And her argument is that the feminist intellectuals, once they took more positions in the university, were really no less prone to this kind of behavior. We're really no less likely to be kind of incompassionate. We're no less likely to get into the stardom game. And really at that point, it becomes about doing obscure theory that's not particularly helpful for the movement, that's not going to engender much in the way of structural change. And so specifically, what's missing to Epstein is a real kind of radical feminist core. That sustains a critique of society. And especially points up women's subordination. And she's still, and obviously, right, that's still out there in society. We don't see that very much as a mainstream critique. We don't really have, a recognizable core. I think this is true. We don't really have a recognizable core of radical feminists, in the way that, right, so you could go back to those times of Schlafly, like Linnea is pointing out, so Schlafly became this kind of, anti-feminist, right? But she could argue with people like Friedan, who is like a recognizable, and I wouldn't even call Friedan a particularly radical feminist, but a recognizable voice for feminism. An intellectual who's in the public sphere, and yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Epstein. You really don't see much of that at this point. Thinking about the intellectual feminism that's found in universities. It's people like Judith Butler who do like great work, but try to get. Just try to read Butler. I mean, I read Butler, and it's a challenge for me. It's certainly not the kind of stuff that reaches out to a mass public. Okay, so that's all about movement decline, though. I would be a little cautious to take it too far, though. Because I would say, what are the successes of the feminist movement? And certainly there's impact success in terms of as she points out, the professions, but things like Sorry, I'm drawing a blank. Right, that's not a good sign. I'm drawing a blank on the successes of the women's movement. Well, things like no-fault divorce, things like the understanding of marital rape as criminal, the recognition of acquaintance rape, like these kinds of things. I mean, I think are structural successes, or at least, you know, I'll put a question mark there. I'll let you kind of think about that. But, you know, does the recognition of rape on campuses, you know, constitute structural success? You know, does the fact that every campus in America now, well, I'm sure there's a few exceptions, but basically every campus now, you know, is teaching students, you know, what sexual harassment is and what the boundaries of acceptable sexual behavior are. Is the broad applicability, not just applicability, but broad application of Title IX, you know, is that something that goes beyond impact and into structural change? I mean, at least think we could think about it in those terms. Okay. Are there specific questions with that? Okay, let me just look now at, and so I'll save, by the way, I will save the whiteboard for you and post that on the Moodle if that's of use to you. I'm going to take a quick look at Moodle right now and kind of see what you guys were thinking for today. And okay, who will I pick on? Maddie. Yeah, so Maddie asks this question that I kind of start off with. Would the women's marches and Me Too signal the beginning of a new wave of feminism? And I think that's, you know, that's an important thing to point out, right? Is that so some people have been arguing that so yeah, the first wave being suffrage, the second wave being you know, equal rights amendment kind of stuff, the third wave being intersectionality in the 80s, 90s, and some people are now saying, you know, this is the fourth wave. You know, and I think you know, as Linnea pointed out, you know, maybe conceiving of it in terms of these more specific movements around harassment, et cetera. It's still, I think it's still important though, right, that we consider that there's not I think as strong a push for structural change. I mean, there was really, you know, I guess it was, you know, maybe still too radical or factionalized. You know, there were people talking about sort of changing the nature of mothering. You know, of making men much more involved in child rearing, of doing structural things to encourage that, which I think are really kind of off the table at this point, as far as I see it. So, you know, the fourth wave, but a very kind of specified fourth wave that doesn't certainly live up to the standard, you know, the maybe very high standard that Epstein establishes. And Maddie also, right, kind of points us to this question with the environment. Yeah, right. So the consumer responsibility thing. You know, so do consumers have a responsibility to purchase less polluting products? And we might also carry that further to say, like, you know, aren't or shouldn't EJ organizations be oriented a bit toward that? And that is a good question, a good point. Although I would say, you know, there is a certain amount of structural thinking that really sort of questions the efficaciousness of consumer behavior, because there's a wide wide swath of consumers, a lot of consumers who will just never really pay attention to anything but price and product satisfaction, right? Boycotts and those sorts of things have limited applicability. And also, we got to remember the kind of pollution that these authors, the environmental justice movement have been about, are really about pollution that's either downstream of the consumer. So we're talking about waste burning plants, where the consumer's garbage just ends up, consumer or industrial garbage that never was near a consumer, is being burned and polluting communities. Or we're talking about things that are really far upstream of the consumer. So like, oil refineries in Argentina and that kind of thing, that it's hard to know exactly who to boycott with those situations. And so this kind of calls on these movements to be really addressing firms specifically, or addressing governments specifically, to worry about these polluting sites. Okay, it looks like we're at full time for today. So we'll be moving kind of quickly through towards the end here. I'm talking about Almeida on Thursday. So keep chipping away at your case studies that are due next week, and read that next chapter of Almeida. And I will see you on Thursday. Bye.